everyone. Sorry we're starting a bit later than planned. It's been one of those Monday mornings, I think. So welcome to, I think it's our third Democratic Marxism seminars or lecture this year. And just to give you a bit of background about this particular seminar, we decided to honor one of the, not just one of the great scholars and activists from Africa, from the continent, but also, I think, one of the 20th century's most incredible scholar activists that we saw. And we were actually losing an entire generation. We just received a message this morning from Michael Leibowitz, who was Marta Hanaga's husband, a partner, and he was echoing that sentiment. We're losing a whole generation, and I think Samir passing remarks that as well. So the Democratic Marxism series, just for those who don't know about it, it started, I think it was in 2014 or 13. We started with it has a volume that Satgar edits, an edited volume series with it, but we decided to start a seminar and public lecture series where we bring top Marxist scholars from around the world and locally every year, and we host between 3 and 4 of them, sometimes even 5 a year. And so this is part of that series. And we realized we started doing this because we realized we needed to have discussion and debate. And we have, I'm assuming I haven't met you, but I think you're Saito, yeah? So he's going to be, it's part of the Emancipatory Futures Project, but we really welcome you as well. He's part of the inspiration of having that seminar series is linked to the Democratic Marxism. Okay, so Samir Amin was one of Africa's leading Marxist and world system scholars. He was originally from Egypt. His father was Egyptian and his mother was French, and he grew up largely in Cairo, but also in Paris. He studied in Paris, and he joined the French Communist Party in the 1950s, in the early 1950s. But being the critical thinker that he was, I think he became very critical of the Soviet Marxism, and this was before the Euro-communism kind of took its formation, and he distanced himself from that. I think he tended more towards a Maoist type of Marxism. And I think that's partly why he resonates with many people on this continent, is his criticisms of these rigid Marxism. In 1957, then, he returned to Egypt and worked under Nasser's government in the Institution for Economic Management, but he left Egypt, and in 1960 he became an advisor to the Ministry of Planning in Bamako, Mali in 1960-63. So remember, this was a time when all these countries were becoming independent, and he was very involved in the post-independence rebuilding of these countries. He then went from Mali to Dakar, where he worked at the IDEP at the University of Dakar until 1980. And in 1980, he became the director of the Third World Forum, and I think he really took it to new heights. He remained involved until his passing, and he always lived between Dakar, and he had a footing in Paris as well, but his home, I think, was really Africa. His work spans many decades in which he developed seminal ideas, and I think many of us have been influenced by a number of his ideas, such as delinking, rent-sinking imperialism, as well as non-Eurocentric Marxism, the global monopoly phase of capitalism, anti-imperialism. I think we'll hear about a lot of this today, so I won't go on. But throughout his life, he remained active. He remained active as a political activist and as a scholar. He always saw the two were kind of interconnected. And I think some of us in the room had the good fortune of meeting him on a few occasions. When Vish and I were in Dakar, we spent an afternoon with him, and he was just such a generous humanist and wonderful human being. And even, I think he was in his 80s at that time already, and just had a sparkle in his eye when he talked about his politics and his activism. So he never lost his commitment. Okay, so the way we're structuring this seminar today is each speaker is going to have about 20 minutes, Patrick, and I'll cut them off really strongly at 25. We want to have enough time for people to have have time for discussion. We're not going to have a break between the two morning speakers. We're going to go straight into Langa after Patrick, and then we'll have a short coffee break. So let me just quickly introduce both Patrick and Langa so I don't have to waste time in between later. Patrick Bond is a distinguished professor of political economy at WITS. Distinguished professor, Patrick. He completed his doctoral studies at Johns Hopkins University under David Harvey's supervision, specializing in economic, environmental, and social aspects of uneven development. He worked with Samir Amin on compiling the alternative report on Africa in early 2018. I mean, what was Samir, 87 at that point? Extraordinary. At 87, he still is an extraordinary thinker. So that was in 2018, as well as on a dozen other international networks since the late 1990s, and he was active with Samir Amin, so he has a close connection with Samir Amin. The second speaker this morning will be Langa Zita. He's a former Central Committee member of the SACP. I think many of you know him from those days. He was a former Director General and a former member of the South African Parliament. He has co-edited a book with Vish Satgar and contributed a chapter to a book co-edited by Samir Amin. He is currently the Director of Political Education and Training for the ANC in the Gauteng province. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Patrick, and I will be very disciplined with time.
Great, yeah, that's great.
As Michelle said, my name is Langa Zita. I work for the ANC. Just a brief comment on my relationship with Amin. Before I interacted with Samir, I received an instruction from him. It was during the work of Hein Marais. If you remember the first book that Marais wrote, the instruction from Samir through advice he got from some comrades in South Africa was that I was supposed to work with that book with Marais, so that as an activist you're always busy, so you don't have time. So, but I assisted Hein, and if you can look at the first edition of that book, the main of the paper that I worked on that reflected the book. That was before I met Samir. Okay? And then I subsequently met him in workshops, etc., etc. I went to about 6 conferences with him. And I must say that that was one of the best moments of my life, one could say. Because being with the company of Samir, well, it was close to being in the company of Marx. Because, truly speaking, there's no scholar, radical scholar in Africa that has come close to what Samir has been able to offer us beautifully over decades. What I plan to do is to maybe look at Samir's contribution to the concept of delinking, but more than that, do what Samir would have expected of us, which is to use his ideas as weapons and to see that whether in the current context in which we find ourselves, how can we use those weapons to think through challenges that we face in South Africa and to find ways in which his corpus can help us navigate a way forward for us in this country. The first point I want to make is that Amin comes to the conclusion of Delinking after having understood and analyzed what you call worldwide expansion of capitalism. He notes 3 key moments in this expansion. The first one being from the 15th to the 19th century, which in his view was basically autocentric. It was within the logic of nation states, and that was the principal definition of capitalism at this time. Yeah? It operated, from Samir's words, from what we call a national law of value. He then identifies another period from the 19th century to the Second World War, in which he makes the point that here it coincides with the rise of imperialism, but still continues to reflect again more this national law. Okay? But then from the Second World War onwards up until today, he talks about the emergence of the global world system, in which what one calls the world, the global law of value, becomes a critical dimension in the evolution of the world system. He goes on then to make a fundamental observation in some of his other work, he says that this observation is something maybe that was not observed by Marx, which is that this worldwide expansion of capitalism has got an immanent tendency to polarization. He said that polarization, which is the reproduction of wealth and poverty, okay, at a global scale, is something that is a feature of capitalism. He said that maybe the optimism of modernity made people not to see this dimension of capitalism. So he said that worldwide expansion has got what we call an immanent tendency to polarize between what one calls centers and peripheries. He moves on then that this polarization is untenable, it is debilitating, it is destructive, it is painful, it is vicious to those of us in the third world who are the subjects of this polarization. And as a result, over time, there have been these revolts, okay? Whether it is the 1917 revolt, 1949 revolt, 59 revolts in Cuba, 49 in China, the national liberation movements, all of these are expressions of revolts on this polarizing impact of global capital. And it therefore says that as a response to this, the way for these subjects of this polarization to deal with it is to delink. He defines delinking as not autarky. It's not really, it's not abandoning. It's not breaking out from the world. It is, however, about subjecting your own imperative of national development to your own laws, to your own national criteria, as against subjecting it to the global law of value or to the global criteria. So this is the important fact. If you are to develop, if you want to develop, you must create a capacity in which you're not just exporting minerals, you're not just exporting foodstuffs or whatever, primary products. How that you first and foremost look at developing your own internal economy, your own national market, and you see that as the basis of your production, of your participation in the global economy. Now, as I said, what Samir would have expected us not really to eulogize about it. So he would be disturbed if we to do that. Nor to locate our debates of you only from within the framework of his thinking. No, he would actually be disturbed. He would want us to define from the specifics that we find ourselves challenges of transformation and to elaborate ways of fighting. So his Third World Forum was basically a network of revolutionary intellectuals coming together to share views on how to advance revolutions in the various places in which they find themselves. Now, if one were to then look as to what would Samir mean to South Africa, okay? What can we draw from Langa thinking with regard to the socio-economic formation we call South Africa? At a glance, if you look at the South African economy, okay, I'm in particular telescoping it more around Gauteng. I know that it was a wonderful slide, but just couldn't get to put it here. But in summary, but I think that Gauteng is from a microcosm of the national economy. You'll find that if you look at the contribution to the GDP, mining makes about 3%, manufacturing about 15%, activities and construction about 4%, trade 14%, transport 10%, finance 24%, and then community service. So if you look at community service, about 26%. If you look at this trend, okay, the emergence over time of the centrality of finance is a feature that's not unique to South Africa, it's a global feature. For instance, Andre Gors tells us in 2009 that of the 500 firms in Standard & Poor, of the Standard & Poor Index, these firms own about 643 billion dollars, which find possible employment only in the financial industry. This apparent propensity of the great firms does not in any way contradict the contradiction of overall profits that are in the productive sector. So what we are saying is that what we call one of the key features of what we call the global economy has been this financialization. That even companies, whether in material production, okay, you'll find that most of the profit that they make, okay, whether it's with AT&T or wherever, they make most of their money using financial instruments. What is the defining feature of the South African economy? On the face of it, you can say that the South African economy is about the super exploitation of the black majority. This dimension, this quasi-colonial or colonial legacy dimension remains with us. Okay? But added to this, which sometimes we do not really make a point about, not as clear as it should be, is that this socio-economic formation is also, how would I put it, subordinated to another logic. Okay? Both black people and white people are subjected to the global imperatives of global capital. So we, together as a country, despite our differences, we are all forced to find a way to find ourselves within a structured framework, which is that of the global economy. But more particularly, coming back again to the South African economy, I'll come back to this subordination, is what some have called the minerals energy complex. Okay? What do we mean by this? Essentially that the South African economy is composed of key mining activities, which is coal, gold, diamond, and other mining activities, electricity, blah, 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 blah. But the critical importance here is what one would call the interconnections. One, that 19% of our electricity is generated from coal, and 43% of this electricity is consumed in the mining industry. So people like Rastomji and Fine argue that essentially in South Africa, when we talk about the character of our accumulation path, it is better to talk about an NEC part and a non-NEC part, even with regard to manufacturing. Another way of looking at us is to see South Africa as what Amin would call a semi-periphery or an enclave, okay? Which is that yes, we've got this colonial relationship or post-colonial relationship between black people and white people, but as I said earlier on, we are really an enclave in which both blacks and white are subordinated to the global economy. Now, what are the features of an enclavity? The first thing is that all of these enclave economies, okay, and here we're working mainly borrowing from Kaimone, interpreted by Olukushi in the conference that was the UN conference in Durban, which is that enclave economies are externally oriented, there's no attention to the home market and effective demand. It focuses on the demands of the sender, there are no backup linkages. Technology does not address the needs of such sectors in the informal sector, what one call the popular classes. Of course, as Amin said, this character, this enclave character of these third world economies reflect what we call this immanent tendency, which is from the beginning polarization. He said the effect of this polarization has been that it has postponed socialism in the north, whilst in the south it calls for a different path of development. Such a different path of development, one should promote what we call structural change. It should look at changes in the factors of production in which there's more role for capital, that is, there's more investment, that the principal factor of our participation in the world economy is not primary production, but value-added products, okay, which would need the capital allocation, money, etc. The point, therefore, is that there is indeed a synergy between Samir's concept of delinking and what we've come to call the developmental state. For Samir, the state has to be the instrument of national protection and self-assertion. That is, it has to be the instrument of what we call delinking, in the sense of subordination of the external relation to the logic of internal development. I want to argue that there is a similarity in the relationship between what Samir considers as this delinking economy to what has been achieved, for instance, by such countries as South Korea, in which the state played a seminal role. And here, allow me to quote from Alice Amstead in her magisterial book, Asia's the next giant. She said that the state's role in late industrialization is to mediate market forces. The state in late industrialization has intervened to address the needs of both savers and investors, and both exporters and importers, by creating multiple prices. Some interest rates are higher than others. Importers and exporters face different prices for foreign currency. Insofar as the state in late industrialization has intervened to establish multiple prices in the same market, state cannot be said to have gotten relative prices right, as dictated by supply and demand. In fact, the state in late industrialization has set relative prices wrong in order to create profitable investment opportunities. She goes on to talk about what she would call that the state here assumes what she calls entrepreneurial capability. Explaining this entrepreneurialism, she says, and I quote her, the initiative to end the new manufacturing branches has come primarily from the public sphere. Every major shift in industrial diversification in the decades of the 1960s and 1970s was instigated by the state. The state masterminded the early import substitution projects in cement, fertilizers, oil refinery, and synthetic fibers. The last greatly improving the profitability of the expanded textiles industry. The government also kept alive some unprofitable factories inherited from the colonial period, factories that eventually provided key personnel to the modern general machinery and shipbuilding, which the state also promoted. The transformation from light to heavy industry came at the state's behest in the form of integrated iron and steel mill, which the state pushed for in the early 1960s, and too early it seems, and then provided over in the late 1970s. Again, this is comes from 1999. Now, the point here is that if we are to delink, we must reclaim the role of the state. Okay? We must reassert the role of the state. And I think for me, the state has to be reasserted in these following ways. It should play a role, one, in the selection of industry. Two, it should provide what we call conditional support. It must secure markets and ensure that there is access to cheap credit as well as innovation. On the selection, the state has to ensure that it identifies what sector to develop and why. It could be labor absorbing, as in the textile, or they will be strategic in as far as being able to secure for us, based on manufacturing, foreign exchange. It should be conditional support. Such conditional support entails one, discipline and the ability to target. It must allow failing companies to fail. And ensure that those in the same sector who are competent take the lead. That's what the South Korean state. It must secure the market. In South Korea, this was not done by the state. It was put out as a key performance indicator that every company that gets support must be globally competitive. Okay? And if you fail, that the state support will withdraw. In Emilia-Romagna, you know, the state goes as far as to even secure the market. Okay? And has created innovative institutions to achieve this. It must ensure that there's access to cheap credit. Okay? And that those companies operating in these targeted sectors receive cheap credit. It maintains our situation, ensuring that we build new or align current banks to financial imperatives of the development state or of a delinked social formation. It must ensure that there's access to innovation. Okay? Now, This was done in the South Korean case by making interface between universities and these sub-targeted sectors. I think the Emilia-Romagna case, the state built in wonderful institutions that ensured that the best trends in each of the sectors that were supported by the state were made available to the managers of these companies, etc. About 10 minutes, 5. I'm almost through. What does this mean for South Africa? It means that we must look, if we agree on this concept of delinking, if we agree on the concept of delinking as exemplified by Emilia-Romagna and South Korea and other related cases in East Asia, etc., we must therefore talk about elaborating a new relationship between a new institution that support structural change. With structural change clearly defined, which is something that South Africans are afraid to see. That when we talk about structural change, when we talk about delinking, it is one of the instruments we have if we want to forward, not only to have a popular path of development, but also to catch up, to make South Africa equivalent to some of these other countries in Europe. Of course, sensitive to ecological dimensions. The second thing is that the development state has to find a way to deal with popular classes. Okay? It must not only work with dominant companies, it must also work with medium-sized companies, which will be closer to popular classes, small companies and cooperatives. In a base document we adopted as the NC in Gauteng in our last conference in the province, we talked about a state that exhibits the working class orientation of national democratic revolution. And we believe that we can draw and look at this state and popular classes on Marxist insights on the concept of the political economy of the working class. Drawing on this perspective, comrades, we think that some few reforms would be necessary. I think the first one would be proper agrarian reform. It's not in the news, it's important. That we must think why we failed for 25 years to transform our countryside. And I think one of the fundamental reasons for me is that the former homeland, which is where the majority of black people are and have access to some land, is not functional or necessary to the reproduction of South African society. We don't need production in Transkei to get food, to get bread in the shops. And as long as it is not meaningful to the socio-economic formation, we need to look at a different strategy. I want to argue that we need to pursue these rural areas as platforms for exports. Ensure that the same capabilities we have in the wine industry in Western Cape, you've got them all throughout the former homeland. That would be the first reform, agrarian reform. Second one is the basic income grant, okay, to deal with the current problems of high unemployment. The third reform is selection. We need to ensure that we are able to select. Our government supports everyone without discrimination. We must discriminate. If we want to transform South Africa, we cannot just make everyone equal. There are different determinants in pursuing structural change. So we must begin to say which of the sectors we are going to support and why. We must have what I call conditional support. Okay? As I said, those who are doing badly must be allowed to fail. We must ensure that we secure the market. As I said, we must also ensure that we're able to access cheap credit, including accessing innovation. Now, this would of course be costly. How do we pay for it? I believe that if we were to consolidate the current abused resources in the PIC, in the IDC, look at the annual allocation of the DTI, and maybe with extra allocation from the Treasury, we would have the architecture that can ensure that this is achieved. In a meeting we had this year, again in the province, we took a decision, we call it a resolution, we come from conferences in ANC Speak, where we agreed that we determine the pivot of the Gauteng economy We will look at a strong focus on industrialization, reindustrialization, strategic and labor absorbing sectors. We will identify priority sectors in the economy for growth and development, and look at addressing barriers of entry of SMEs, ensure that we create access to markets for SMEs, establish a single window for SME financing and access to innovation, etc. These are some of the things that we have committed ourselves this year to do. So, in conclusion, I think that there is a lot we can learn from an engagement with the work of Samir Amin. I think that he, more than many, has looked at the real impediments to the growth of southern economies. And I think that his concept of delinking has immense potential for us in South Africa if we understand it not just as simplistic or talking, but as a complex process in which we subordinate the logic of our own internal needs as the principal criteria of our participation in the public economy. I think these are possible, and I think that we welcome any contribution for you guys on how best we can do this. Thank you very much.
Hi again everyone, I'm Devin Pillay from the Sociology Department, and I'm very pleased to welcome our next two speakers. But before that, just to briefly mention my own relationship with Samir Amin. I actually got to know him partly through Hein Marais, and worked on a book on labor, globalization, and challenges of labor and the challenges of globalization. And Samir Amin has always been very critical of the labor movement. And of course, as some of the issues that emerged this morning may have indicated, he was very strong on the anti-imperialist dimension, but perhaps not as focused on the possibilities of cross-class solidarity and the role of the urban working class. But nevertheless, what I liked, what I admired about him was that he had this project, and he came to our meetings. We went to meet with the Swedish labor movement in Sweden, discussed the role of the urbanized working class in the fight against capitalism, etc. And he was very open to engagement. So I want to endorse that view of him as a very accommodating thinker, even if he had his own particular ideas on issues. Our two speakers, well, the first one, Samantha Hargreaves, who's the founder and director of Woman African Alliance. Samantha has a long history of work on the land, agrarian and extractive terrain. She previously worked for the National Land Committee, Action Aid International, and offers solidarity support to various movements of landless people, rural women, and more recently, communities and networks fighting extractive industries. Satgar, who you, I think all of you know, but just to remind you, is an associate professor of international relations at Wits. He's the principal investigator for the Emancipatory Futures Studies in the Anthropocene Project and editor of the Democratic Marxism book series. And he has been an activist for over 3 decades. Part of it in the Communist Party, and then you were kicked out for opposing Zuma, among other things. In the Communist Party, one thing that Vish did, which I still talk about, by the way, to my classes, is that he promoted food gardens way back then, and the Communist Party never took it seriously. And just imagine if they took it seriously, if you had a political movement behind this. People would, in urban areas at least, would be self-sufficient in food. But still, it's a struggle that is still carrying on. He's co-founder of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign and the Climate Justice Charter process. It's now 11:30, Samantha, 20 minutes.
Thanks, Dylan. Okay. Hi, everyone. So I want to start by speaking about my sort of identity as an activist. So I identify as an eco-socialist feminist. This understanding has really grown out of the work that I've been doing, in particular in the last 8-9 years continentally, working with communities that are affected by large-scale extractive industries. And I think Samir Amin's theory and ideas have been so central to the formation of many activist analysis and ideas around the world today. And I think that ability to offer tools for us to make sense of the world, but more importantly to think about how we change the world, is really important for those of us that define as activists. Okay, so looking at it from the perspective of an organization, the Women Alliance, where I land, I work there, that's where I earn my salary at the end of every day. My activism is much bigger than that. But for women, we have drawn on a number of theoreticians and academics to shape our understanding of what we're seeing in the world. And so, for example, we've drawn quite actively on Latin American theorists, Gudiones or Costa, that look at the extractive industries through the lens of this idea of extractivism, and then translate it into post-extractivism as an alternative and critiquing new forms of extractivism around the world. So that's sort of one line of ideas and concepts that come to us. Very importantly, a lot of, as we know, Marxist thinkers miss the perspective of women in development, so from feminist perspectives, and for us, working continentally on extractive industries, and we see all of the vast externalized ecological costs that are carried by ecosystems, by people living in these communities, and ultimately the planet. It's been very important for us to grasp ecology. And so eco-socialist thinking, and in our case eco-feminist thinking, that comes through people such as Maria Miss, Silvia Federici, as well as our own Jackie Koch, have been really important in forming our thinking. In terms of Samir Amin, unfortunately we haven't drawn on his thinking as much as we should have. And so reading quite a lot more of his analysis and thinking over the last few weeks has been quite interesting. And I think a lot of those of us that are working on mining and extractives on the continent and elsewhere in the global south, there are strong anti-imperialist positions that are explicitly adopted, especially amongst more left thinkers and organizations. So he gifts a lot of ideas and thinking there that's very important. I think the questions of delinking and autonomism are interesting ones, and there's sort of a resonance with the post-extractivist thinking from Latin America that's very appealing. So I just wanted to say that for Samir Amin, he was not just a theoretician and an academic, he was an activist, and he defined as such. So what he gifts us, the ideas and the analysis and the tools, are really important in shaping our thinking, our activism, and our struggles as activists. And there's enormous gratitude for that. I guess as I was reading a lot of his stuff again, and new stuff that I hadn't read before, I was seeing that he'd started to think more around ecology in the last few years. And Patrick shared a piece on, I think it's called World something value, accumulation of world values. Anyway, so a piece that he wrote in 2018, he sort of starts to go to ecology. And I think given his ability to locate the global south in the center-periphery analysis, and his very sharp analysis around imperialism, I think he would have offered quite a profound analysis and thinking for those of us, and it's not just a few of us, it's the vast majority of the world today that are dealing with the ecological and climate fallout. So I think I just wanted to sort of preface it there. So WOMAN, what are we? We're a continental alliance. We're quite a new alliance. We started building in 2012. We launched in 2013. We work across East, West, and Southern Africa in 11 countries. We work with close partners and allies. We try and find the most progressive organizations in each one of those contexts, not always successfully so. South Africa is quite a different animal in terms of progressive politics. We have focused a lot of attention on uncovering extractivism and its impacts on the continent, in particular its impacts on peasant communities and women in particular. We contest extractivism in its current form, which is deeply exploitative and serves imperialist objectives. But we also spend a lot of time with people on the ground thinking about the alternatives, and we believe quite strongly that in the ways in which people live and produce every day, and in particular the work that women do every day on the front lines of social reproduction, is really what we need to be looking at if we're going to be thinking about a different way of living and relating to nature. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about the alternatives from the perspective of the majority of women on this continent. So that's about women. I wanted to start, the first sort of theme that I wanted to address was the whole question of accumulation through mining and the extractives economy in Africa. And I think looking at it through the eyes of Samir, this is probably like the epitome, the most extreme expression of how the imperialist centre has exploited the periphery. And so this is unbroken over centuries. And so this is just a map, a more contemporary map of resources in Africa. And we're continuing to see the ongoing raiding of Africa's resources. So it's historical, it was under colonization and imperialism, new forms of imperialism and new colonization that is ongoing. And extractives is broad. It ranges from forests to fisheries, creation of industrial fisheries, the obliteration of indigenous forests, as I just mentioned, as well as the extraction of minerals, the relocation of a lot of industrial agricultural production to the global south, which is drawing on our fertile soils, but also our very scarce water resources, which again are part of the extractivist logic. So that's, I think, probably the most explicit expression of the imperialist agenda. So I wanted to point, and I'm not quite sure who is familiar with, another map. This is Canadian mining interests globally. It would be nice to have I would have loved to put up a few images of all of the sort of triad interests on the continent in terms of extractives. But this is just one of them, Canada, or one of the North American interests. So I don't know who's been following the illicit financial flows stuff. Has anyone here been following? Patrick? Okay, so this is, if you want to really understand the logic of imperialism, and it's not new, but it's about tracking where the money is going. And so we had the establishment, because in 2013, the establishment of the high-level panel on illicit financial flows from Africa. It was chaired by Mbeki. It reported in 2015. So there were 3 years of research and analysis. This is just an infographic that summarizes a little bit of what the panel found. But according to the report from the high-level panel, Africa lost approximately 850 billion in illicit financial outflows from the continent between 1970 and 2008. So what are these illicit financial outflows? I think Patrick could probably explain this better than I could. But it's essentially money that's illegally earned, transferred, or used. And it typically originates from 3 sources. And the extractive sector is at the very heart of this. So you have commercial tax evasion, trade misinvoicing, and abusive transfer pricing. So essentially it's companies are hiding the profits they're making through transfer pricing, setting up subsidiaries in other developing parts of the world, these tax havens. The second area is criminal activities, and the third area is bribery and theft by corrupt government officials. Now it's interesting because OSIWA, which is the Open Society Initiative of West Africa, did research a few years ago, and actually they estimated in West Africa, corruption by government officials is tiny. It's 3% of the total. The vast majority of the money that's leaving our continent, essentially it's theft of Africa's resources, is through corporate activity. And so they really are the greatest crooks in the world today, and using the vehicle of corporates, transnational corporations, to do this. So it's interesting, they've done a really interesting, Nigeria's really taken this up quite actively, the question of illicit financial flows. They've had their own internal commissions. Buhari, the president, has taken a very strong line on this. And I was a bit horrified by some of the statistics that I was reading recently. But here, the oil and gas sector of the Nigerian economy is responsible for 93% of the illicit financial flows. 93% of the money that flows out of Nigeria illegally is coming from the extractive sector. In total, it was 218 billion has flowed out of the country between 1970 and 2008. Where is the money going? It's the same actors. It is the US, Spain, France, and Germany are major beneficiaries of this theft. So I think Samir Amin, his framework helps us read all of this quite powerfully. So despite all of this, and this sort of analysis has been around for quite a period, the whole question of the theft of Africa's resources, are our governments, are continental institutions adopting a more critical perspective around extractives and where we locate extractives in our idea of development? And no. So this whole discourse of Africa rising that we've heard, I think, since 2011, has really been centered around the extractive sector. We've had a number of different key policy positions and frameworks at a continental level that really see mining, in particular, as the vehicle for Africa's growth and development. And so it's given expression in the African Mining Vision, its action plan. The African Union adopted an Agenda 2063 in May 2013 that again sort of centralizes extractives and mining as the vehicle for Africa's development. So I mean, I think the whole question of can we reform, is it possible to reform this? And I think it comes to the question from the comrade at the back around beneficiation. So if you look at the experience in other parts of the world, and I mean, unfortunately, a lot of these governments have been eclipsed, but a lot of the pink governments in Latin America, that Chavez is one of them, that we're seeing a stream of income from the extractive sector as the kickstart to development and redistribution in those countries. There was a real hope and possibility that this could happen. And yes, I think in Venezuela, for example, you have seen, not right now, but under Chavez's period, there was definite improvements. There were the revenues from the oil sector were being used to support social security schemes, improved education, better healthcare. There's a solid critique of that, though, in that and Patrick would speak about this well, I'm not going to go into this in much depth, but it's the whole question of the loss of sovereign wealth when we are extracting resources on very unfair terms. This has remained a problem for other countries in the world that have tried to reform the extractive sector and use it as a basis for development. But the externalized social and economic and environmental costs of continuing to extract minerals at such a large scale that are not in the interests of the nation. It's not in the sovereign's interest. Venezuela was still selling oil at extremely unfair prices to a global market that was stacked against them. That is just the reality of how the global south is incorporated into global capitalism. So we had to do some really serious rethinking. So what's been happening on our continent? We've had quite a few of the leading mineral producers on this continent. Zambia, Tanzania keeps coming up very controversially with the real attempts to hold mining companies accountable for all of the theft that's been happening. Magufuli has been engaged in a big battle with, is it Arcadia? Arcadian mines?
Barrick.
No, it's the Acacia Mines of Barrick Gold, which is one of the biggest gold mining companies in the world. It's a Canadian mining company. So I think a lot of countries have tried hard to put in place basic policy frameworks. There's been attempts to reform tax regimes, so doing sovereign tax, royalty taxes, trying to block the ability of international corporations to write off tax payments to tax. And they haven't succeeded very well, and this is really because of the way that power is stacked against our countries. And I think this is one of the questions for me around the delinking. Given this highly globalized world and the extremely powerful nature of these corporations that we're dealing with, what does this mean for delinking? Because I think there have been solid attempts by at least some of our governments to put in place a better infrastructure to regulate mining companies, but very unsuccessfully. So this accumulation by the extractive sector is really made possible by very weak policy and legislative frameworks. Oh my God, 5 minutes, where did it go? Okay, all right, let me run. Okay, Amin's primary argument is that value is transferred from periphery to core, and it's mainly through the pricing of labor. So where returns to labor at the periphery are less than returns to labor at the center, and get that. I think the concern that I have, and this is where I think perspectives like from Luxembourg and Harvey come in really, is looking at the scale of dispossession that accompanies this development model, an extractivist development model, and there's a real raiding of the resources, land, water, forests, minerals of poor communities across the continent. And I can give you many, many examples of the shape and form of that. In Uganda, massive land dispossession, paving the way for the oil industry in Uganda. A lot of this, again, in service of Chinese, Indian, as well as Russian capital and US capital. So that's just one example. In the Tete province in Mozambique, which is the epicenter of the coal industry there, in fact, in Southern Africa as a whole, there have been massive dislocations. And again, here controversially, it's been India, Jindal, and China, as well as Brazil, that have been implicated in coal extraction. They're the ones extracting coal in Mozambique. And there's been massive dislocation. People have lost their land, no compensation, resettled on barren areas of land, no water, no access to health services. So this is the type of dispossession that we're seeing, and it's a dispossession which is not compensated. Communities are losing vast resources with no or minimal compensation. Yes, our states are gaining some mining rent, but again, it's very compromised by the configuration of power. So governments, corporations are, as I said, through illicit financial flows, they're hiding money and they're stealing money. So that's the first thing. I think the whole question of accumulation through dispossession that we're seeing in the extractive sector is critical. And I am seeing it's fairly absent in his analysis. And I'm not saying Harvey offers the finest analysis of this located in the imperialist world, but it's a very important idea that's missing. The second thing that is really missing from Amin's analysis, and this is very unfortunate, is Amin didn't see women. He wasn't able to read development from the perspective of women and how it was impacting women in the global south. And so he misses the whole vast political question of reproductive labor. And I mean, Woman has theorized this extensively in our work, and it's around how the labor, the unpaid labor of women across the continent, across the whole global south, get incorporated into this system of accumulation. And essentially it's unpaid labor, it's not recognized, and it essentially it's a core part of how corporates and the elite are accumulating profit. And so let me illustrate what I mean by this. So if you look at, for example, in the DRC, we're working around the Inga Dam there. They're now heading into phase 3 of the Inga Dam. Phases 1 and 2 were during the Mobutu Sese Seko era. But there people were forcibly removed, never compensated. They're still living in camps. There's no water, there's no electricity, even though they're living next to hydropower dams, but the electricity lines pass over the heads of people living in the camp. As I said, no compensation, and it's really through the labor of women. They've lost access to land. It's women who are eking out a living for their families with no resources. having to carry multiple informal sector jobs, providing a lot of additional labour because there's no access to electricity, and cleaning up a lot of the damage, ongoing damage of the dams. This is unpaid labour. This is reproductive labour that's not acknowledged and is not counted when we think of how profits are being accumulated by corporations. So that was the one critical question that I wanted to bring in. I wanted to speak around the climate and ecological crisis, but maybe I address this during the question and answer period, or could I just have 1 minute? Okay, so let me just go to the question of climate and ecology. And as I said earlier, he starts to go there in around mid of the last decade, like around 2015, and then he's right, probably the most critical expression of his analysis around ecology comes in this paper in 2018. He doesn't say very much. I mean, what he does acknowledge, and I just want to sort of read it back to you, he acknowledges Marx's position that accumulation is founded on the destruction of all bases of wealth, human beings and their natural environment, and he importantly acknowledged that the current expansion of capitalism is destroying the planet and humanity. He correctly concludes that socialism has to be ecological. So he starts to echo the very important work of eco-socialists around the world, but I don't think he ever defined as an eco-socialist. And I have some really important statistics around what's happening at the moment in terms of the climate crisis. And we're not heading into the crisis, we actually are in the crisis right now. And we are heading to climate catastrophe, and that's just a few decades off. And so we're seeing massive species loss at a rate that we've never seen before. We're seeing rising temperatures. This year, again, we've broken another record, at least in Europe now, and we're heading towards that in the southern hemisphere, but we've broken another record. It's the hottest year on record. I was listening to the radio coming here today. The average temperature here in South Africa in this winter period is 2 to 3 degrees warmer than it has ever been in recorded history. So this is what is happening, and it is ramping up, and there are loops, feedback loops, that scientists have not even been able to incorporate. So you've got the peat bogs, it's the permanent ice around the world, is melting at such a rapid rate. In Canada, 52,000 hectares of the peat bogs. This is frozen, it's the frozen soil that's been frozen for 10,000 years more, is melting at a rate that was unexpected. We've got the Arctic ice melting. All of these are kicking in new emissions of carbon, which again are fueling the heating of the planet. And so I think given all of that, if we're going to be thinking around like how do we conceive of development and how we think about an alternative development pathway, how we think about delinking has to be fundamentally shaped by this reality that we are facing. And so I don't have answers to the question that I asked of Langa. I think Patrick, for example, when he responded, he was saying that we need to be fighting investments from the banks, from the IFIs that are about supporting fossil fuels-based energy. We have to say no. We have to demand accountability of the banks for investments, for example, in Delinking that are part of fueling climate change. We have to be thinking creatively around renewable energy. Our government's investing in fossil fuels and coal. This is a coal-based energy economy still. We are barely transitioning out of it. There's a huge potential to delink through renewable energy. Langa talks about agrarian reform. I totally agree with you. I think here we have failed. We have not done the agrarian reform that we needed to do. But we have to be thinking about that now in a period of climate crisis. The reality is that we have had endless rounds of El Nino droughts in the southern hemisphere, and those will not go away. We're going to see successive droughts that are going to impede our ability and the ability of farmers to produce. What are we doing about that? The delinking is about thinking through how do we support transitions away from destructive development, but towards a way of ensuring that people can actually survive the crisis we're in now and the catastrophe that lies ahead in just a few decades. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you.
same format as earlier, and I think we should pick up on those themes.
I just need to get this around the climate crisis and catastrophe and so on. We have with us Kohai Saito from Japan, and his book on Marx and eco-socialism won the Isaac Duce Award. He's going to be here for the next 3 days with us. He'll be enriching our conversations and debates about eco-socialism. Jane, I just need some help here. I don't know what I'm doing here. And so, oh, wait, it's come up. And so I'd really invite you all to come. Tomorrow he'll be leading on a chapter, the next 2 days, 2 chapters of his award-winning book. And then on Thursday in this room at 5:30 he'll be giving a public lecture on Marx and the Anthropocene. So very relevant to these issues. I'm not sure if I'm getting this right. Oh yeah. Okay, so Samir Amin, in my view, marked 3 generations coming out of the 20th century with his intellectual interventions. Samir put the Marxist method to work in a way that wasn't just original in terms of how he understood, if you like, the world system of capitalism. But he was always ahead of the curve in trying to work on what was new, what was emerging and developing in capitalism. So he was really up there kind of critiquing, if you like, the imperial chaos of the US in the early 90s. He was up there and ahead critiquing the postmodern turn. He was there, actually, before he left also, grappling with the rising new fascism of our times. So, you know, for somebody like myself who has fought with Samir Amin as an activist, it's a big loss. You could always look in that direction and know that here was somebody who was solid. Samir Amin wasn't a populist, by the way. These days, to be on the left means to be populist. I'm sorry, he wasn't a populist. Here was somebody who was solid, he was rigorous, and you knew that in your engagement with Samir, in a dialogue with Samir intellectually, you were getting something reliable. Okay? And I think that's what's missing, if you like, with the loss of Samir and many of his generation. And I think that, as Michelle said, Michael Leibowitz this morning sent some of us a message. He was the partner of Marta Hanecker. And again, this whole generation is getting lost. And we've got to build another layer of Marxist intellectuals and activists. The other point to make about Samir, in terms of my own life, was as I mentioned, with Langa. It was trying to weaponize the Communist Party with Samir Amin. And you know, we presented in different ways to the Communist Party many of Samir Amin's ideas when the Communist Party was outmaneuvered in the 90s. Langa leading on delinking, what we were doing in Gauteng, rethinking the idea of transition, drawing on Samir Amin, trying to build that socialist logic when we talk about building socialism now and the elements of socialism. But of course, all of this was lost on the popes because they never understood the politics that goes with delinking, and that's why they defeated today. But anyway, and they of course expelled some of us, but that's fine. One of the first encounters with Samir Amin also was on this journey that Langa and I were on. We were doing political education in the Communist Party, and we felt that, you know, with the end of the Soviet Union, and we acknowledge its contributions to humanity and so on, but we also knew it was a great opportunity to rethink beyond Sovietized socialism. So we went on this journey to interview leading Marxist thinkers and intellectuals in the world. And one of the important contributions in this volume, in a question and answer format, because we are educators, popular educators, was to bring back this knowledge to workers and shop stewards and so on, was with Samir Amin. It's one of the longest interviews done with Samir Amin. It's over 40-something pages. Now this is before he's given so many interviews out there on the internet and so on. So, of course, we couldn't publish this book because Blaine Zimande was General Secretary of the Communist Party. But it came out 10 years later, so it's there. and it's a very important, I would think, attempt by some of us on the left in South Africa to grapple with the intellectual inheritance we have and thoughts of other leading Marxists. This is now outside the Communist Party and continuing this project of renewing a thinking Marxism, a democratic Marxism. Because really, when you read Samir Amin, while he is very rigorous about the big revolutions that we've had in modern history, Samir Amin wasn't glib about democracy. He wasn't a liberal. And he had this beautiful phrase, more democracy, not less. And I always use it. And if you read his work, even in intervening in the debates about the shift to low-intensity democracy, Samir was up there saying, no, we need to deepen democracy. We need to build democratic subjectivities, etc., etc. And this continues as a theme in his life. And so he gave an endorsement for the second volume in the Democratic Marxism series, again affirming a very important premise in his thinking, that the breakthrough in the world system will come from the peripheries of capitalism. And that's how he read this volume and this text, and so on. So in many ways, he was a kindred spirit in using the Marxist method, not in some doctrinaire way, of course very serious in his grounding in Marx, but also trying to think about what is happening to capitalism, and so on. So Samir made a call for a new international. And I'm going to spend some time talking about this. He first made this call in 2008 in French, and then he published it in English in Z Books. We are actually publishing this original contribution in the next volume in the Democratic Marxism series, volume 5, which is really about BRICS and the new imperialism today. Because we do believe that Samir was leading the debate about renewing anti-imperialism. In 2017, he continued trying to make this call, and he put out a piece, It is Imperative to Reconstruct the International of Workers and Peoples. And then on the 24th of June 2018, just before he died, he put out a letter of intent for an inaugural meeting of the International of Workers and Peoples. And again, trying to beat this drum, trying to draw attention to the sort of political imperative of global convergence of the left. So the starting point for Samir's arguments is the universality of capitalism, and he recognizes that while capitalism is everywhere, we also have workers, we have the protagonists of resistance and change, the people that also need an international response. But he builds an argument centered on understanding why, if you like, progressive forces have not been able to congeal and aggregate an effective response. And he provides an analysis of the structural conditions that mitigates against this. He reflects on the failures and lessons of historical internationals, going back to the 19th century, and trying to kind of distill from that experience what is relevant for today. And of course, as somebody that has been located in the periphery of capitalism, he also reflects on the role of the Bandung Project, the revolutionary nationalist moment, and its contribution to struggles. And of course, both its positive contributions and its limits. And then he brings us to the present, around the new frontiers of struggle. How do we reflect on politics? How do we think strategy? And of course, towards the Fifth International. So just to very quickly kind of run through his arguments. Samir Amin recognizes that at a concrete historical level of analysis, capital and labor is important. And you see it in the centers of capitalism. But it doesn't really give us a fully textured understanding of social relations in the world. And this is why he was a non-Eurocentric Marxist. Because he also understood that in the peripheries of capitalism, there were other class forces that were engendered by global capitalism, like the world's peasantry. And that was very, very important. And there were other victims of capitalism. So he recognizes that this adds to the diversity, and it adds to the challenge of how we think about aggregating and converging forces. He also speaks about the structural divide in global capitalism. And again, this has been a theme in Marxism. Feminists like Nancy Fraser also bring it to the fore. I mean, building on Rosa Luxemburg, for example, production, reproduction, nature. and human beings, the polity and economy. But Samir adds this idea consistently, developing an insight of Rosa Luxemburg around this structural fault line, the polarization that Langa was talking about. And again, this adds to the complexity and the challenge of working with diversity. And then, of course, he talks about a world system at the center based on competition between states. He also talks about the conscription of hegemonic blocks, including the working class, in alignments with capital. And that also complicates how we build solidarities and, if you like, find convergences around universalities of class exploitation and so on. The division of labor is being remade, and that further segments and divides the working class. Strategies of capital as well feed into the complexity of finding convergence and unity. His second argument reflects very quickly on the experience of internationalism. And the first international for him was very, very important because it reflected democracy and convergence. It reflected plurality and diversity, including of anarchists and Marxists and others, libertarians and so on. In the second international, he makes the observation about how party-based politics really dominates, and of course, in this context, there's also a shift towards imperialism in social democratic parties and national chauvinism, and this continues even after World War II. The third international is also reflected on very critically, and again based on party-based politics, but conveyor belt-based, commandist, and of course married to the defense of the Soviet bloc in the 20th century. But Samir is very critical of this. While he acknowledges that there were certain gains and breakthroughs, etc., this is not the politics that he's talking about for renewing internationalism. He also mentions, of course, other anti-capitalist attempts to build internationalism, including the Bandung moment and the tricontinental that comes out of the Cuban Revolution. His third argument is in reflecting on Bandung. So yes, there were gains of industrial development in the peripheries, but Samir also problematizes this in terms of illusions of catch-up development, and particularly poses the question, can the bourgeoisie lead the development process in the peripheries of capitalism? And he's very, very critical. I mean, he says no. Of course, he also makes the point about the fact that after World War II and so on, you're actually seeing class struggles and popular struggles in every country, in every part of the world. You're also seeing the rise of the Chinese proletariat, and of course they define a particular project for themselves, led by their party, and so on. Slightly different from the Bandung project, instead of the bourgeoisie leading. Of course, Bandung gets defeated, and in Samir's analysis of the global political economy of capitalism, we are seeing a new phase in the development of monopoly capitalism, the rise of global monopolies. And he talks about the 5 big global monopolies that are at the center of the global political economy, that have even pushed back the peripheries. And of course, he's always critical of also the potentiality in China, India, and Brazil in terms of the transition moments right now, the possibilities and the contradictions, and what this means for strategies and tactics. His fourth argument is that Bandung and the internationals of old are finished. The 3 big projects that animated the 20th century are also over. And we have to understand the offensive of imperialism and capitalism today. What is going on? And this is where the rhetoric around the 4th Industrial Revolution and so on really is ungrounded. And this is where Samir Amin is very, very helpful, because he looks at the deeper underpinnings of global accumulation, the division of labor today, the new subjects of history. So what's happening in this technological transformation of the division of labor? The digital proletariat, he alludes to these kinds of things, doesn't get into it. China does not overcome the center-periphery divide, in his view, in this article that he's written. It does not really overcome imperial domination. He also goes on to talk about a collective triadic imperialism, centered on the US, Europe, and Japan, and various instruments of control and discipline that they've used from the WTO, IMF, World Bank, etc., etc. And of course, the central leadership role of the US in terms of its military capabilities. And he's saying these are very crucial challenges that we on the left have to grapple with in terms of trying to find a way forward for a new internationalism. His other argument is, well, how do we grapple with politics? What is politics today? And he rejects vanguardism. So he's a Marxist, like me, but he's not a supporter of the elite, professional, revolutionary caste that has all the answers, etc., etc. Samir affirms and valorizes the crucial importance of diversity on the left. And for me, this resonates with the democratic Marxism project. There's a whole field of anti-capitalist forces that we need to engage with and learn from, etc., including eco-feminists and so on. He's also against the apolitical movement because there are tendencies out there today to depoliticize, to kind of present politics as not being about power relations and so on. But he's also about thinking with the historical experience of internationalism and actually suggesting that the first international provided some kind of template. We don't have to reproduce it, but there is a point of reference, something positive about the values it embodied on diversity, etc. Very similar to the World Social Forum. His other argument is that today capitalism is against all of humanity, and there's an interesting ecological echo in this particular piece where he talks about the ecological crisis to some extent, he doesn't go into it. He talks about the enclosures of peasant societies, he talks about the pluralist anti-capitalist subject, and really trying to find the convergence when we're thinking about strategy of immediate objectives and the long-term goal of socialism and communism. He also problematizes, if you like, the European heartland and the crisis of the state. And he sees the contradiction not as rivalries, economic rivalries between Europe and the US. He actually foregrounds, if you like, the Americanization of Europe as a crucial tension between Europe and the US going forward. He also recognizes that ruling classes in the periphery have become lumpen, okay, particularly in our continent. So the point about illicit flows, etc. But also he recognizes that fundamentalisms, and this is what I love about Samir Amin, okay? He takes on political Islam head on. He's not confused about these things. He will even take on the populism of the EFF, for example, in his last piece on fascism today. Okay? He doesn't, and it's pity Patrick's not here because him and I disagree. I think Patrick's wrong in vaunting some of these forces, actually. This is the groundedness of Samir Amin, which some of us are going to miss. China, and of course, he's very, very, very reflective on China and the contradictory dynamics there. And he's also not certain that the gains, even of the peasantry in China, can be defended going forward. And of course, the limits of India and Brazil. And then, of course, his last argument is that we really got to think about how do we build convergences amongst peoples against capitalism. And really keeping in mind, of course, that we are looking for a diversity to advance a socialism, like the First International, and it's not just parties that need to be aggregated and brought together. And then, of course, he provides a set of ideas to kind of intervene against imperialism. And of course, central to, again, how he's thinking about convergence is socialism and democracy. He keeps on beating this drum. You cannot have a socialism without democracy, but he also says you cannot have democracy without social progress. So to conclude, there's a few important critical issues we need to think about. Some of us, as Patrick alluded, in a conversation with various comrades in different parts of the world around grappling with this idea of a Fifth International. There's going to be a meeting soon of these forces, and I'm actually going to share your interactions, your inputs with these comrades, and so let me test these things. So one of the crucial conjunctural shifts, so Samir was very alive to the conjuncture in his analysis, and he did foreground the rise of the new right. He doesn't do it in this piece, but I think it's very, very important to underline. And it is a neo-fascist right that's on the march in the world today. It is also an eco-fascist right. It's basically exorating climate change, as Samantha was saying. It's the global gas chamber. And we really have to foreground this as well. And this is in the context in which the left is very weak compared to the interwar years. So the second coming of fascism is a very, very serious threat to us all. And so in this context also we've got to be grappling with the renewal of a new internationalism. The other point is about how solidarities are happening today across boundaries. You know, Patrick was critical about the petty bourgeois convergence around Samir. But there's another problem today. I mean, you know, today people are wanting to promote a version of struggle in the global north that we must all just download. Okay, and I think that's a fundamental problem. It's completely insensitive to our own traditions and histories of struggle. Whether it's Extinction Rebellion, whether it's Greta Thunberg and the Futures, Fridays for Futures, I'm very sensitive to those things. I think they're playing a very positive role, an important thing. But again, is that how we build solidarities? By just mimetic politics, by just copying, and so on and so on. So I think there's something for us to kind of disentangle rigorously around building solidarities today, and how do we build it in a way that is about genuine plurality and convergence and so on. The other quick point is around the national. Because I think Samir wasn't blind to the fact that we've got to organize in the national space. And this is the conversation and the debate I'm having with all his other friends in other parts of the world. If we're going to build the Fifth International, it's got to be rooted. It's not just the gathering of a few of us radical activists and intellectuals and so on. And so it's got to come out of struggles. And so, you know, in the context of fighting against extractivism, in the context of us pushing back against carbon capital, etc., how do we build international solidarities? So I've handed out a call for September 20th action, and it comes out of a roundtable with children and youth. And we are targeting Sasol as our national target. And we are using that target to call for solidarity with La Via Campesina and UNAC in Mozambique to push back against Sasol there. We are calling on Black Lives Matter and the Sunrise Movement in the US to push back, and others to push back against Sasol in the US. So it's not just North-South solidarity, it's South-North solidarity as well. So again, grounded in us trying to put together a climate justice charter and ensure that internationalism is two-way. Finally, if we agree with working towards a Fifth International, how should this come about, comrades? I really look forward to your feedback on this question. As I said, there is a larger conversation going on a planetary scale with others that have been close to Samir, and we've thought with Samir and so on. So your feedback on this idea would be very, very important. Thank you.